Hello, good morning. This is Young Suk Kim, Associate Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Samuel Dwight Proctor School of Theology here in Virginia Union University. This morning, my topic is about the atonement. Atonement. Jesus' death is understood in certain way in relation to human salvation. So here we are going to discuss some issues regarding Jesus' death, the view of Jesus' death, how we understand Jesus' death after he died, regardless of his motive or his motivation for his work. But after he died, many followers of him and Christians have understood his life and his death in certain way. So my topic today is about how to understand Jesus' death. Let me share my PowerPoint screen. Atonement Theology and Paul. What is atonement? You know, the word atonement is very interesting because there are three elements there at 1 month. So to be one, right, at 1 month. So the idea is there must be 1 month between God and humanity. So in other words, atonement is about reconciliation between God and humanity. But the cause of estrangement are many. For example, sin lies in between God and humanity. So the problem is a sin, certainly, impurity, right? And also we may think of disobedience of humanity to God. Whenever humans are disobedient to God, automatically there is an estrangement between God and humanity, which result in estrangement. In other words, there's no reconciliation between God and humanity. When there is estrangement between God and humanity, there must be punishment of God, and humans are captivated by the devil, captivity by the devil. There's no freedom because people are captured by the devil. And humans also have lived a life of a condemnation here on earth. Even before they died, they still have the consequence of condemnation. So there was different proposals to the issue of estrangement. In other words, how we can be reconciled to God. So solution, there's no one way of a solution. You know, different people and Christians and different times have understood the solution differently. So here, I'm gonna talk about historically different views of atonement or Jesus' death, the significance of Jesus' death, how people understand it. First of all here, propitiation. Propitiation, this idea is coming from a Greco-Roman world, Greek world, where you are having bad relationship with your God, right? What you have to do, you have to make sacrifice. You have to offer a special gift, sacrifice to the angry God, so to speak. So Jesus' death is understood as sin sacrifice or sin offering for sinners. Why? There's a need to allay or pacify God's wrath or anger. So here God is viewed as a vengeful. Interesting, isn't it? God is vengeful. There must be something gift that should be offered to God. Why? To allay God's wrath. The other idea we call expiation, and this is also a very traditional idea. Expiation is a kind of a cost, a mending price or cost. When you do something wrong, you have to compensate. You have to, pay the things that you have caused other people, right? Mending price or cost. So Jesus' death as mending cost or price between God and humanity. Something should be compensated. So God is relational. We can think God is concerned with relationality, right? The broken relationship should be what? Mended, repaired. To make that happen, there must be a cost. That is Jesus' death. That theory that we call expiation. The other traditional theory of atonement that we call ransom theory. Ransom is a price. Jesus' death is a ransom price paid to the devil to release the captives. So here, the view is God is hard to understand, Morally speaking, this theory is really hard to understand. Why does God require Jesus to be, killed and just to pay for the price of ransom and paying to the devil? That's really a weird idea. But in early Christianity, there are some people who thought that this way, Jesus' death is kind of price, a ransom price to get paid for, right? Release of the captives. The other theory here we have penal substitution theory. Penal substitution, penal means a punishment. Substitution, the word, a substitute for. So the idea here is Jesus was punished instead of humanity. Otherwise, humans got to be punished, damned and condemned and punished and forever. But Jesus was substitute. Jesus was punished instead of us, instead of humanity. So here the view is God is punishing, right? Punishment that we should avoid. So penal substitution theory help to explain why Jesus, was crucified or died. Still, the other theory we have here made by Anselm, in 9th century, satisfaction theory says Jesus' death should be sinless, perfect sacrifice. Again, Jesus must be what? Sinless, perfect, sinless person who can make a sacrifice. Why? To meet God's highest moral standard. God is such a God who is highly, highly morally, a highest standard. So no sinner can make a sacrifice to satisfy God's justice. Such a God needs only what? Sinless, perfect sacrifice. Who is that? Jesus must be the perfect, sinless sacrifice, which is acceptable to God. That theory is what? Satisfaction theory. God is concerned with moral perfection, right? So interesting. But most recently, in a way, 20th century, many Christian scholars have different view now. They say Jesus' death is primarily, is what? Righteous suffering. In other words, he did not die for just, to forgive sins, But Jesus' death is primarily a moral sacrifice. Jesus testified to God's righteousness. Jesus said and did what? The righteous things. That's why he was opposed and hated by the world. He was sacrificed because of his righteous ministry, righteous suffering, innocent death, right? That view is pretty much, strong in a certain circle of scholars. So righteous suffering. But my view is still different. Jesus' death as the culmination of his faithfulness. So here I'm emphasizing Jesus' faithfulness on one hand, and also his unavoidable death. Jesus is the locus of reconciliation, not merely his death, but Jesus, including his whole life and death. Jesus' whole life and death. So Jesus is the locus of reconciliation. God recognizes Jesus' faithfulness because he was demonstrating God's righteousness. At the risk of his life, he gave his life to testify God's righteousness, to reveal God's love and justice in the world. So God, first of all, recognizes Jesus' faithfulness. And then in Romans 3:26, God justifies those who share in Jesus' faithfulness. God justifies those who have the faith of Jesus. That's what we can translate, pistis Jesu in Romans 3:26 as subjective genitive. Subjective genitive. God justifies those who share in Jesus' faithfulness. So my alternative view is actually checked and seen in this small book, Jesus as Locus of Reconciliation, the subtitle, Paul's Theology of Atonement. This statement, as it is seen in a book description, Jesus' death is not required for atonement. Oh, it's interesting. Jesus' death is not required for atonement. It is unwanted yet unavoidable. This is the key word. It is unwanted yet unavoidable because of his testimony. Because of what? His testimony to God's righteousness. Here, another key word for Paul is God's righteousness. Not his death alone as such, but his life and death together prove that he was faithful to God. What kind of God? The righteousness of God. God's righteousness means God is the one who is steadfast and loving and justice and merciful. Jesus was faithful to that God. God considers Jesus to be the place of reconciliation. That's what we read in Romans 3:25. God put forward Jesus as what? Hilasterion, which I translate the place of reconciliation. Because of his faithfulness. So Jesus, not his faith, not his sacrifice. Jesus is the locus of reconciliation. This whole lot important to me. Oftentimes people emphasizing only his death as if he came to die. No, he did not come to die, but he came to testify to the truth of God, to reveal God's justice and love to the world. So Jesus, not his sacrifice alone, Jesus is the locus of reconciliation that humans must come to participate in his faithfulness. Let me continue. So this book explores an alternative understanding of atonement in Paul's undisputed letters. In doing so, it distinguishes Paul's theology from later writings, such as the Deutero-Pauline letters, pastoral letters, or Hebrews, and interprets the cause of Jesus' death differently. Traditionally, as we saw before, Jesus' death has been understood as vicarious suffering, right? Vicarious instead of us, which deals with the guilt of sin, God's punishment, God's moral justice, or liberation from sin's power, as we saw in the traditional atonement theories. But in an alternative understanding of the atonement, sin's problem or the fundamental issue for humanity is a disobedience or unfaithfulness to God. Unfaithfulness to God or disobedience to God, that is the rock bottom cause of estrangement between God and humanity. So unfaithfulness or disobedience is the fundamental cause of estrangement between God and us. That's all a new understanding. So let me continue. This problem or issue may be resolved when one repents, meaning change of mind, through participating in Jesus' faithfulness. Through participating in Jesus' faithfulness that ended up his crucifixion, a multifarious climactic event that reveals God's righteousness and Jesus' grace. On one hand, God dealt with the past of humanity, infused with sins of disobedience because of Jesus' faithfulness and his sacrifice. And on the other hand, he opened a new path of reconciliation or atonement to those who participate in Jesus' life and death. Often people think that Paul cares about Jesus' death only. I don't think so, which is understood as no more than a vicarious sacrifice, as if Jesus came to die, simply to die, as if that was the sole purpose of his life, came to die. Subsequently, they do not consider Jesus' faithfulness and his obedience to God's will, that all humans also need the same kind of faith, same type of faith. Even if our faith is not the same as Jesus' faith, but still we need to follow him. That is what participation in him means. They seem to think that Jesus came to die for them only. That is somehow very problematic for me. But if we read Paul's undisputed letters, Paul's view of Jesus' death is deep and complex, in that Jesus' crucifixion is the result of his life-risking challenge to the wisdom of the world. Jesus' crucifixion is the result of his life-risking challenge to the wisdom of the world. What's needed is faithful living. Faithful living. The radical concept of atonement requires human participation in Jesus' life and death. Let me reiterate this whole lot about my book, content. The radical concept of atonement requires human participation in Jesus' life and death. Jesus is the locus of reconciliation. This is my theme, and this is and preaching and lecture and all about my book. Jesus' sacrifice is not required for atonement or reconciliation. It is unwanted, yet unavoidable because of his testimony to God's righteousness. We need an alternative view of atonement, where sins are forgiven, not because Jesus died for sinners, but because they repent of their sins, looking to his cross and all his faithful journey toward God's righteousness. This is the end of my presentation. So I hope you have enjoyed my lecture, presentation about the atonement, which is so important to Christians and Christian theology. I proposed my alternative understanding of Jesus' death. I hope you will engage with me by reading some of my books and articles, other stuff. Hopefully, I may get, to engage with you in other formats, other times. Thanks for watching my presentation, and God bless you. Bye-bye.